There are 6 billion humans on the planet, and each of us is a member of the same species, Homo sapiens, wise man. But it hasn't always been this way. For most of our history, we shared the world with other types of humans. What happened to them? The best known, but least understood of ancient species are our closest relatives, the Neanderthals. They were tougher and stronger and more robust than modern humans. And for 200,000 years, they had Ice Age Europe to themselves. The valleys of Central Europe were prime real estate for the Neanderthals. They lived in limestone caves like this at Vinja in northern Croatia, a classic Neanderthal site.
I've been coming here 33 years. Whenever I come, I think I will meet Neanderthals. I can just feel them, I can smell them. This is just a perfect shelter for Neanderthals. There's a spring nearby. They could rest here. They could survive here for a long period of time. And there is a lot of evidence that they lived here for decades and decades, for millennia and millennia.
Yakov Radovčić was one of the archaeologists who excavated Vinja Cave in the 1970s and the early 80s. They uncovered thousands of bones. Most were animal remains, but in among them were the bones of Neanderthals.
Some of these bones could be easily identified. If they are complete, you can easily say this is a cave bear, this is an animal remain, or this could be a human remain. But some of these fragments cannot be identified easily. For instance, this bone, we call it Vindia 80 or V80. There is nothing special about this bone. This could be cave bear, it could be human. The only way to prove that this is a human Neanderthal remain is DNA testing.
In 2005, the V80 bone fragment is brought from Croatia to Germany. Its destination? The Max Planck Institute in Leipzig. Here, a team of geneticists is trying to extract and analyze Neanderthal DNA. They have no blood or tissue to work with, only ancient degraded bone fragments. None of the samples they've analyzed so far has the amount of DNA they need. But then, they test the bone from Vinja, V80. Working in a super clean laboratory to reduce contamination, researcher Johannes Krause cuts into the bone. He drills a sample from the center where the bone is best preserved and mixes it with a solvent, which draws out any DNA that might survive. The results are startling. This fragment of leg bone, V80, yields far more usable DNA than any other bone they've tested. Maybe there was something special about the man who died, or the circumstances of his death, or conditions in Vinja Cave. Something which helped preserve his DNA. Whatever the reason, V80 is the best source of Neanderthal DNA in the world.
Most of the bones have too little Neanderthal DNA or are heavily contaminated that we cannot use them. But fortunately, this bone from the Vinja cave has so much Neanderthal DNA and such a good quality of Neanderthal DNA that I think we are pretty optimistic that we can actually sequence its DNA.
But why go to all the effort? What can scientists learn from Neanderthal DNA? They're hoping to find out more about human biology and solve one of the great mysteries of human evolution. For 150 years, scientists have been puzzled by the fate of Neanderthals, why such a strong, well-adapted species disappeared. One of the world's leading anthropologists, Ian Tattersall, believes we're to blame. Our ancestors must have forced the Neanderthals into extinction. Homo sapiens, modern humans, evolved in Africa. We didn't set foot on European soil until around 40,000 years ago. But once we did, it was only a matter of time before we ran into the inhabitants of this continent, the Neanderthals.
Modern humans would clearly have seen something very similar to themselves in these creatures that they encountered in this new world that they were entering. But I think that as soon as they would have had any form of interaction, they would have recognized that here was a different kind of entity to themselves. I don't think that they would have identified with each other particularly closely. And I think they would have perceived themselves as being in competition.
Such encounters could have occurred all over Europe. What happened next? Did modern humans simply slaughter the Neanderthals? Or was the competition more subtle? Instead of killing them, maybe we were better at finding food. There's evidence that we had a more varied diet than most Neanderthals. Whatever happened, modern humans, our ancestors, won out. Today, it's obvious who dominates the planet. Neanderthals are no more. But anthropologist John Hawkes believes this version of the story is way too simple. He thinks that modern humans were not really so different from the Neanderthals. When they met, our ancestors would have been curious, not hostile.
It would be insane to go out and pick a fight. You're not a military organization going in, looking to conquer. You're a small group yourself. You sort of have to, find a way to live with the locals, and as you do that, you learn from them to some extent. And the locals learn from you. I feel like the defense attorney for the Neanderthals sometimes. I'm trying to see the ways that they overlap with us and trying to add complexity to the story, because any story that involves things happening over a continent over thousands of years, it's got to be complicated.
How far might the interaction have gone? Instead of making war, perhaps they made love. And the two species exchanged genes. It's an intriguing idea, but very hard to prove. The fossils are inconclusive. The answers lie in DNA. And reading the DNA of a Neanderthal is hugely complex. Even when scientists can extract enough material from a bone like V80, to read it, they have to decipher its entire genetic code. This would be impossible using conventional technology, because the DNA is so old and mixed up. They needed a technological breakthrough. This is the backyard of biotech businessman and innovator Jonathan Rothberg. He's built his own version of a prehistoric stone circle loosely based on Stonehenge. It's an astronomically accurate clock that marks the birth date of his children. His son Noah was born in July 1999. but there were complications, and he was rushed into the ER. So began a chain of events that would lead to the sequencing of Neanderthal DNA.
My son wasn't breathing. My son had turned blue. I wanted to know if we could read off his genome, would we know what medicine to give him? Would I know not to worry? Would I know what to do? And that night, I saw a computer magazine. And in that computer magazine was a picture of a new computer chip. And that computer chip had 10 million transistors on it. And literally a light bulb went off in my head. If I could move sequencing to a chip, we could miniaturize it like the computer guys had done. My son recovered. I was on paternity leave, and I spent the next 2 weeks moving sequencing to a chip.
For Rothberg to revolutionize genetic sequencing, he needed to find a way of turning DNA into a digital signal that could be read by a computer. For inspiration, he turned to a childhood memory.
As a kid, I remember that there was actually an animal that would move biological information to something that was more digital. And this might sound nutty, but it's the firefly. We've all watched these fireflies on cold evenings or warm evenings in the summer in New England blink. And using the enzymes from fireflies, I literally devised a system over the next few weeks that would take a letter of DNA and turn it into a pulse of light.
Within a year, Rothberg had patented a new method of sequencing DNA that was 100 times faster than what had come before. And he formed a new company, 454 Life Sciences. To explore the potential of the technology, 454 hooks up with the Max Planck Institute in Leipzig and takes on one of the biggest challenges in genetics, sequencing Neanderthal DNA. In summer 2006, the Neanderthal Genome Project begins. Samples of DNA from Leipzig start arriving in Connecticut. Among them, the star sample from Croatian bone V80. The sequencing machines are working around the clock, sifting through billions of letters of genetic code, trying to figure out the order, the sequence of every one of them. The team at 454 believes it can crack the code within 2 years.
If we can get the complete genome sequence of a Neanderthal, you're looking at 20,000 genes.
In the 17th century, Joachim Neander liked to compose hymns while walking in a valley near Dusseldorf. The locals later named the valley in his honor, Neander Valley, in German, Neanderthal. One day in 1856, quarry workers were blasting for limestone in the Neander Valley. They opened up a hidden cave and made one of the great archaeological discoveries. Inside the cave were 16 bones, part of a human skeleton. They looked unusual, deformed perhaps. One scientist declared that they were the bones of a Cossack soldier with rickets who had died in the Napoleonic Wars. But in reality, these bones were much older and far more intriguing.
You compare it to a classic mystery story, where at the beginning somebody's dead, and you've got to figure out what happened to him. That's exactly what you had with the Neanderthals. You've got these bodies that turn up in the 19th century, and people know that they're different from us, and there's something that happened here.
This was the dawn of evolutionary theory. Scientists were looking for evidence that humans, like other animals, had evolved from more primitive life forms. These bones were all the evidence they needed. Here was an ancient type of human that had gone extinct. They named him after the valley in which he was found, Neander Valley, Neanderthal. And so began 150 years of speculation about the Neanderthals. With each new discovery, scientists argued over every detail.
In a mystery novel, you have more characters that get introduced, and they all have their own motives, and it's exactly what happens with us in the science. We have different ideas that come up from time to time because the story changes every time we get a new piece of evidence.
In 1908, a nearly complete Neanderthal skeleton was discovered at La Chapelle-aux-Saints in France. Anthropologist Marcelin Boule took it upon himself to measure the bones as no one had before. As part of his research, he commissioned an illustration of Neanderthal man that was more ape than human. This knuckle-swinging brute could not stand straight. His knees were bent, his head jutted forward.
You never get a second chance to make a first impression, they say. And the first impression that Neanderthals made on anybody was made by Marcelin Boule, who said, Neanderthals, they're hunched over, they're ape-like, they're stupid, they're everything that a modern early 20th century intellectual would never want to be. And that big, vast difference between us and them has been the image that entered the popular imagination.
In the centuries since Marcelin Boule's research, archaeologists have uncovered the bones of some 400 Neanderthals, and they tell a different story.
Marcelin Boule clearly got it wrong. Neanderthals stood upright and walked with the same kind of abilities as you and I. They would have been stockier, shorter, big barrel chests, which seems to be an adaptation for cold.
In a cold climate, a body that's stocky and broad insulates the vital organs. Short limbs reduce the body's surface area, which conserves heat. Even the Neanderthal nose may have been an adaptation to the climate, warming the cold air before it reaches the lungs. But what really sets Neanderthals apart is their strength. Their bones were thicker and more robust than ours. Their physique was similar to a modern bodybuilder.
From the muscle markings, you can see these are very powerful people. They're not somebody I'd want to meet in the dark alley where you have upset them for some reason.
But strangely, for such strong, powerful people, many of their bones show signs of traumatic injury to the skull, neck, shoulders, arms, and legs. When scientists tried to find another group of humans, ancient or modern, with the same pattern of injuries, they came up with just one match: professional rodeo riders.
I broke my collarbone, my foot, had 2 knee surgeries, and stitches, and just little bumps and bruises other than that. Not too bad. Broke my collarbone twice last year. I broke my pelvis, arms, ribs, lots of them.
I broke my pelvic bone, tore my left groin out, and I've had a few broken bones here and there, a lot of torn muscles. It's not when you get hurt, it's how bad,
Why should Neanderthals living in Ice Age Europe have suffered the same sort of injuries as modern rodeo riders? John Hawkes believes he knows the answer. Like rodeo riders, Neanderthals were often in close contact with large animals. They hunted big game, bison, rhino, red deer. But their spears weren't designed for throwing. They had to impale the animals, and that's inherently risky.
Now you have to imagine their hunting style. They've got these thrusting spears. They're getting up close to the animals and thrusting them in. And they're doing it in groups because you can't do this by yourself. These guys are facing the possibility of tremendous catastrophic injury every time they go out and hunt. And the pattern of injuries is very much like modern-day rodeo athletes. These guys who are in close contact with animals, who are in some instances helpless before them. They fall on the ground, they get head and neck injuries, they get trunk injuries, and they get arm injuries. That's the pattern that we're looking at.
Although the riders are the stars of the rodeo, they're surrounded by a big backup team. Taking on a large wild animal, there's safety in numbers. The same would have been true for Neanderthals.
Every one of these riders out here has 5 or 6 guys whose job is to try to keep them as safe as possible. The bullfighters, the stockmen, they're all trying to keep the animals away from the rider when he gets bucked off. Neanderthals would have had to have a group of this many guys working together as a team to try to keep themselves safe, because otherwise it would have been much more dangerous than it already was.
"100 years ago, Marcel Boule created the popular image of Neanderthals as simple, apish brutes. But if, as some modern scientists believe, they were really hunting in teams, working together to ambush animals and avoid injury, they were far more sophisticated than Boule ever let on. Gradually, Neanderthal man is being rehabilitated. But there is one stain on his reputation that won't go away. A number of Neanderthal bones have been discovered showing signs of fragmentation. They seem to have been split open, not by natural causes nor by animals, but by other Neanderthals.
This tibia is an interesting example of fragmentation, this lower leg bone, because there were flake scars on it that suggest that it was broken when it was still fresh. So it was still a greasy bone, probably very soon after the Neanderthal died. But it was still been full of marrow, and in all probability was broken open by somebody with an interest of getting that marrow out of the tibia.
Since Boule's time, Neanderthals have been accused of cannibalism. The evidence is hotly debated. But in parts of Central Europe, at least, the practice may have been common.
People were very hungry during the Ice Age. They were looking for sources of meat and protein, and they were consuming one another, even to the level of breaking open the long bones for the last bit of marrow and fat that you get inside of them as a source of food.
If Neanderthals were eating each other, and perhaps Boule was partly right, they were primitive, thinking and behaving like animals, not sophisticated humans. But does the evidence really bear this out? The only way to know for sure is to explore the mind of a Neanderthal. Neanderthals were strong, physically impressive humans. But how intelligent were they compared to us? We'll never know for sure because Neanderthal brains don't fossilize. But some Neanderthal skulls do survive, and they've been measured and analyzed in minute detail.
So the first thing that strikes you when you see a Neanderthal skull are the really big eyebrows, doubly arched, very thick brow ridges, very massive face with a huge nasal opening, and when you turn it to the side you can see a very low and elongated brain case. And these differences are really obvious, especially if you compare it to a modern human skull like this one, which is an early modern European skull from Cro-Magnon. Very high, rounded brain case, a much smaller facial skeleton, and no real brow ridges to speak of. especially when compared to the Neanderthal here.
For a long time, it was assumed that the low brain case of the Neanderthal must contain a smaller brain. But the opposite is true. Neanderthal brains were bigger than ours, 10% bigger.
The average brain size for Neanderthals is 1,500 cubic centimeters. This compares to average for modern humans as a whole, 1,350. So, of course, the cliche that a Neanderthal is kind of a stupid individual is certainly not true. Now, whether that means that it's the same kind of intelligence as our own or the same kind of cognition as our own, that's a different matter.
The traditional view among anthropologists is that despite their big brains, Neanderthals crucially lacked the ability to think in symbols, to be creative.
You know, I don't want to say that Neanderthals were not smart. I think they were about as intuitively smart as it's possible for an organism to be. I just don't think that the evidence indicates that they were symbolic in the same way that we are, and certainly in the same way that the modern humans who entered their territory were.
Almost everywhere modern humans lived, they left behind evidence of a creative, symbolic mind. Minerals used as face paint, jewelry made from animal teeth, handprints on rock walls. It's long been thought that Neanderthals did none of these things. One of the most dramatic examples of our ancestors' creativity is to be found in the caves of southern France. Extraordinary paintings deep underground, done by modern humans as they settled in Europe. Although Neanderthals had lived in the same region for thousands of years, they didn't leave behind a single example of cave art. But at the Neanderthal site of Puy de Laz in the Dordogne, archaeologists have found something intriguing. This cave was scattered with hundreds of pieces of manganese dioxide, and Marie Seresi thinks she knows what they were used for.
This piece of manganese dioxide looks like a piece of stone. But if you look at it closer, you will soon notice that here, for example, it's all irregular, all bumpy. But if we turn it and we look at it from here, you will see that there is a straight edge. And if you look at that edge under the microscope, you will see that there is some traces of use.
Archaeologists know one use for manganese dioxide, as a black decorative pigment.
We can clearly imagine a group of Neanderthals preparing themselves for the hunt, decorating themselves, decorating somebody else on the face. It could have been to identify themselves, or it could have been some sort of camouflage during the hunt. It's a clear evidence of complex behavior, which is similar to the behavior of modern humans when they entered Europe.
For scientists like Marie Seresi, the gulf between Neanderthals and modern humans is shrinking. The two species seem so similar in the way they thought and behaved. Sometimes it's hard to distinguish them by the artifacts they left behind. Certainly, when it came to making stone tools, Neanderthals were the equals of modern humans.
This is one of the stone tools we found here. It's called the biface. It's a multi-purpose tool which was used by Neanderthals to do the butchery, because you have here a tip which is very useful to cut the meat and go inside the animal.
A biface in the hands of a modern butcher. How does it compare to his steel knives?
Alors quand je fais ça avec un couteau, c'est la partie que j'aime le moins. Enfin, c'est la partie la plus difficile, je suppose que ça va être pareil. Hein. Mais ceci dit, Ça marche très très bien.
For Neanderthals to have made elaborate tools like this would have required a certain type of mind, the ability to think ahead, to imagine an outcome.
Each time you're gonna hit the rock, you need to think about that hit, but you also need to plan for the future ones. And you have to plan several hits in advance. This is showing that Neanderthals were as smart, at least when we are talking about making those stone tools, as modern humans.
The more we understand about the behavior of Neanderthals, the more resourceful, intelligent, human they seem to be. And now even the charge of cannibalism is being reconsidered. Some scientists believe that although they were cutting the bones of their dead, it may have been for reasons other than sheer hunger. They may have had more noble motives.
This skull is very interesting because it has a series of cuts coming across the forehead here, very regular in an area where you don't have any meat to be removed. So they seem to have been cutting this head to, in various ways, prepare perhaps the skull for later use in some kind of a funerary ritual. It's perhaps some indication of some sort of symbolic behavior, some much more modern kind of behavior by these Neanderthals.
Any evidence that Neanderthals were performing rituals is highly significant. It suggests they had a mind that conceived of an afterlife, capable of abstract thought, a mind like ours. For much of the last 100 years, we've cast the Neanderthals as primitive subhumans, quite unrelated to us. But if they were really so similar in the way they thought and behaved, where should they sit in the human family tree? Were they our distant cousins or our forefathers? The only way to know for sure is to examine our DNA.
Jack Link's Beef Jerky presents Messin' with Sasquatch.
Trailer's awesome.
Jack.
Neanderthals went extinct about 28,000 years ago. But what if they hadn't? If they were still here today, what would we make of them? This question was posed by American scientists in the late 1950s. They felt Neanderthal man had been demonized for too long. He was just like us, they claimed. Give him a bath and some modern clothes, and he would pass unnoticed on the New York subway.
During the 1950s and 60s, there's an anti-racist movement afoot, and people are trying to show that different human races are really not very different from each other. And when you start thinking about the huge diversity between Australians, Africans, Europeans, that's a range of diversity that Neanderthals are not very far from.
The traditional view was that Neanderthal man was an inferior species, an evolutionary dead end. Now scientists wanted to stress how similar Neanderthals and modern humans really were. So similar that perhaps they were really one and the same species. Perhaps we evolved directly from them.
The idea that Neanderthals are somehow part of our diversity and we're all one human family, that really builds. And in the 1980s, that's sort of the dominant paradigm until the Eve theory came along.
The Eve theory was the big genetic story of 1987. Researchers from UC Berkeley had managed to sequence human mitochondrial DNA. Mitochondria are tiny packages of chemical energy inside a living cell. And in each of them is a small loop of DNA with just 37 genes. Analyzing this DNA in a cross-section of different people, the researchers claimed to have traced the ancestry of our species back to a single source. A woman who lived in Africa 200,000 years ago. They called her Eve, as if she were the mother of us all.
The big surprise of the results was that we all came from a relatively small group of people in Africa, and everybody on Earth are descended from them, and even furthermore that we're relatively young.
Some 60,000 years ago, we started migrating out of Africa and took over the world. For the first time, it was possible to produce an accurate family tree of the entire human race, a progression of different species unfolding over millions of years. And at the top of the tree, our species, Homo sapiens, distinct and separate from all those that had come before. The new genetic evidence gave support to a new theory of human evolution, known as out of Africa. The idea is that Homo sapiens, modern humans, evolved in a small corner of East Africa some 200,000 years ago. Over time, the population grew. Modern humans left Africa and started colonizing the world. And wherever they ran into ancient humans, they didn't mix with them, they replaced them. In Europe, this meant the replacement of every Neanderthal. According to the out of Africa theory, modern humans arrived in Europe about 40,000 years ago and took over the continent. It may have taken time, perhaps 12,000 years. But there was something inherently superior about modern humans that gave them, us, a competitive edge.
Once you posit that there's a replacement of people, it's sort of a nice way of saying that hey, these ancient people were annihilated. They're gone. They're not included in the ancestry of later populations.
The Neanderthals would have retreated into remote corners of the continent, heading away from the modern humans, until there was nowhere left to go. Some of the last Neanderthal enclaves were on the Atlantic coast of Portugal. But eventually, even here, modern humans found them.
This is the Atlantic. As soon as you get here, there's nowhere else to go. It's just the end of the world. From a European perspective. Soon after, we recorded their presence in this place. They're no more.
And here, the Neanderthal story may have ended, their fate sealed. Were it not for a remarkable discovery by Portuguese archaeologists, the skeleton of a 4-year-old child who has forced us to think again. With the death of the last Neanderthals 28,000 years ago, modern humans would have had Europe to themselves. They were living in rock shelters like Lagar Vallejo, just miles from the Atlantic coast. This site was discovered quite by chance when a local farmer decided to bulldoze a path through his land.
The bulldozer just terraced all of this area, and at the end of that, he started to clean, scrape the back wall of the shelter. And it actually, if you look up, you can see very well the indentations left by the machine as it worked down from that ledge over there. It went down, it hit the rock at several places, but here there was a recess, so the shovel went down and then continued to work in that direction and stopped.
The bulldozer exposed a burial site in the recess of the wall. And in December 1998, a team of Portuguese archaeologists moved in. They found the skeleton of a young boy who died 24,500 years ago, long after the last known Neanderthals died. The skeleton was very well preserved, virtually intact.
You can see the bulldozer hitting the rock there, and then coming down. So, and the skeleton was just over there, okay? So it came within inches, 3 centimeters of completely obliterating the whole thing. That we were able to find this skeleton is a miracle. It's just a miracle.
The archaeologists soon realized that this boy had been buried in some style. His body had been wrapped in an animal skin, which was covered in red ochre, a pigment used widely by early modern humans. A single pine branch had been lit, presumably to purify the grave in some sort of ritual. Among the remains, there were burial gifts, offerings, perhaps, to the spirits.
This was, a ritual burial, and it was the first time we had such evidence of ritual burial for children from this time period.
The discovery of such an interesting new find attracted the attention of Eric Trinkhaus, a leading expert on prehistoric human anatomy. He wanted to see the bones for himself, up close. There was something odd about the skeleton, something that didn't fit.
One of the first things that I looked at is the lower jaw, and we have a set of baby teeth here. There were some forming permanent teeth that told us that this is a 4 to 5 year old child, and one of its prominent features is this very projecting chin area, which is a distinctively modern human characteristic. But as I worked further on it, one of the things I noticed was that the lower legs appeared to be awfully short for the size of the individual. And if you compare the lower leg bone to the length of the thigh bone, it is considerably shorter, whereas the top of it in an early modern human in Europe would be up here. That is a longer lower leg relative to the thigh, and this child clearly did not have it. And what in fact it has, if you compare the lengths of these, is a perfect match to Neanderthal children of the same age. It didn't strike me right away, but a few days after I was kind of chewing over this, I said, my God, it looks like a Neanderthal.
If this modern human boy had died at least 3,000 years after the Neanderthals went extinct, why should he have had such strange limb proportions? Trinkhaus's explanation was intriguing and controversial. The child's ancestors must have mated with a Neanderthal.
There weren't very many people around. They were all dirty, they were all smelly, they were all basically people. And hey, why not? Sex happens.
Here was the first possible evidence that Homo sapiens and Neanderthals may have mated and produced hybrid children. The news made headlines around the world. These two types of humans may have been lovers, not enemies. If true, this flew in the face of prevailing wisdom about human evolution. According to the out-of-Africa theory, modern humans replaced Neanderthals completely. There was no mixing of genes. There could be no hybrid children.
It seems to me to be just a juvenile burial. It doesn't seem to me that there is any convincing evidence in there to regard it as being in any way a mixture or admixture with Neanderthals. I think it's simply been wrongly interpreted.
A champion of the out-of-Africa theory, Ian Tattersall wrote a scathing commentary rejecting the claims of hybridization.
I have no idea what a Neanderthal modern hybrid would look like. But there's nothing that's convincingly in that role that's been discovered so far.
I've been doing this for 35 years now. I've seen a lot of bones. And when you find something that's not what you'd expect, then it becomes interesting. Then you have a problem. Then you have a problem to solve. But if you always find just what you'd expect, hey, go have a cup of coffee. Why bother?
Trinkhaus and his collaborator João Zilhau went looking for more proof of hybridization. Their search took them to Peștera Coasi in Romania.
Not much space in here. Okay.
Despite having to dive each day to access the excavation site, Zilhau uncovered a mass of cave bear bones.
There you go. In one piece. That looks like human over there, under that long bone. See? Been washed down this
Mixed in among them were the remains of two modern humans that were 40,500 years old.
It's a piece of occipital.
They are the oldest modern human remains ever found in Europe.
Great. It is. Eric and I got involved in this Romanian project, and guess what? We find the same thing. A mosaic of modern human and Neanderthal features in the two individuals in this Romanian cave. So it was not just one. Now we had three.
Trinkhaus decided to review a much bigger selection of early modern humans. Wherever he looked, he found more examples of hybridization. He examined 15 individuals and found hybrid features in all of them.
If you have an open mind and you look at these guys, and you find a distinctive Neanderthal feature in this one, or an archaic feature that should not be in early modern humans in another one, bits and pieces that say, hey folks, this is not an isolated example.
Further evidence of hybridization has shown up in northern Croatia, among the Neanderthals who lived at Vinja Cave. Their bones are similar to those of Neanderthals who lived in the same region 100,000 years earlier, at the nearby site of Krapina. But there are some subtle differences. Their facial features are less robust and more angular than those of the older Neanderthals from Krapina.
By comparing these populations, we can see that they weren't static, they were changing with time. Looking at the chin on the lower jaw, you can see that in Krapina, it's a very flat, receding part of the bone, very different from the chin we have today. Whereas at Vindia, while it's not a true chin in the sense that we have chins today, we have the development of a bump, a hint of a chin, if you like. And this is the kind of feature that one can look at and suggest that perhaps there may have been some sort of hybridization, some kind of interbreeding with anatomically modern people also in the area at that time.
This is a very different take on human history. When modern humans spread out of Africa into Europe and encountered Neanderthals, the result was not annihilation, but assimilation. The blending of two populations into one. Where the out-of-Africa theory stressed competition, the assimilation theory suggests that two types of humans would have found ways to coexist.
The first thing to bear in mind is that Neanderthals did not know they were Neanderthals, and modern humans did not know they were modern humans. Meeting in a valley in Romania or Germany or Portugal, they would just know this guy is not quite like me. No. Can I make alliances with these people? Should I fight them? Or should I try to get in good terms with them? And I would expect a certain level of interbreeding was inevitable.
Did it really happen? Could two different human species mate and produce viable hybrid children? If so, how common would it have been? What are the rules for mating across the species barrier? One place to look for clues about human evolution is in a baboon colony. Like humans, baboons are intelligent social primates, and they come in a variety of species. Here, at the Southwest National Primate Research Center, most are olive baboons from the African savanna. But some are hamadryas, desert baboons, with a distinct pink face and white mane. When they come into contact, the two species will naturally try to mate. But with what results? Researchers here know the family tree of every new infant. They've been able to prove that olives and hamadryas can easily interbreed and produce healthy hybrid offspring.
So this is one of our hybrid males. You can see he's got some pink in the face, but it's not as bright and dramatic as in the purebreds, and he's got other traits.
Anthropologist Trenton Holliday is getting his first look at a hybrid baboon.
Yeah, I was thinking the hair around his head looked like a hamadryas.
The implications are obvious. If these baboons can interbreed, then perhaps modern humans and Neanderthals were doing the same. Some scientists believe that any two species of mammal which have evolved apart for less than 2 million years have the ability to interbreed.
These baboons have been separated from each other somewhere between 500,000 and 1.8 million years ago. If we look to the modern human versus Neanderthal example, we believe that those two species diverged somewhere between 200,000 and 750,000 years ago, much less time. So if these baboons can get together and interbreed, then absolutely Neanderthals and modern humans would have come together, interbred, and produced viable, fertile offspring that could have then reproduced themselves.
If modern humans and Neanderthals did hybridize, could we tell what sort of features their offspring would have had? It's impossible to say for sure. Hybridization is always an unpredictable process.
If we think about the baboon example, sometimes they're a little bigger than their parents, sometimes they're a little smaller than their parents, sometimes they have very pink skin, and sometimes it's a little more gray. But what hybridization does is it brings traits and features together that may not have been brought together in the parental populations. I think the same thing would be true of Neanderthals and modern humans. When they come together, there are going to be new combinations of features that the world had never seen before. And sometimes those new combinations and features would have been advantageous.
Researchers have found just such features and traits in hybrid baboons, mostly among the teeth.
In the hybrid male baboons, 50% of them had extra molar teeth. And in many cases, it wasn't just one extra tooth, but it was on both sides. We found one specimen who actually has 2 canines on either side of his jaw. That is very rare. So this really shows us that when 2 different types of baboons come together and hybridize, you get an increase in the amount of variation in that hybrid population. And that accelerates the process of evolution because selection requires variation to work. The more variation, the more rapidly natural selection can occur.
Is this what happened in human history? Did hybridization speed up our evolution?
It's obvious to anybody on the street that there is an enormous amount of variation in superficial features, pigmentation, hair form, eye color, nose shape. And there's a growing number of these genetic traits that you truly cannot explain in 40,000 years of evolution.
If our ancestors left Africa and started colonizing the world without interbreeding, it's much harder to account for all the genetic diversity of modern people. Some scientists believe that too little time has passed. But if our ancestors left Africa and then blended with ancient humans like the Neanderthals, natural selection would have been given a jolt, producing far greater diversity. This is still only a theory, and many scientists are skeptical about inferring too much from the behavior of baboons.
Interbreeding must have been possible, at least on some level. Closely related species of primates and other mammals interbreed on occasion, so I don't see why Neanderthals and modern humans wouldn't. But the evidence for it is just not there at the moment.
Supporters of hybridization believe the evidence does exist, but most of it is invisible to archaeologists. When two closely related species hybridize, the most significant impact is in soft tissue. Subtle changes to the workings of the organs, to the wiring of the brain, to the structure of cells. These will never show up in bones. But there is another place to look for them.
What a lot of people have been hoping for is that there will be something to settle this argument. And what is hoped will settle it is the genetics. With genetics, you're dealing with information, and the information is in a genetic sequence, and it's hard to argue with that.
For a decade, geneticists have been able to sequence tiny amounts of mitochondrial DNA from Neanderthal bones. But to find proof of hybridization, they need to sequence the entire genome, all the particles of DNA in a cell. And that's easier said than done. Neanderthal bones are so old and degraded that very little DNA survives. And precious few of them are ready to surrender the secrets of their genetic code. What happens to DNA when you die? How long does it last? A week? A year? 38,000 years? This is the best place in the world to study human decomposition as it happens. Welcome to the Body Farm.
How many on the surface? 100 and then...
There are 200 cadavers in these woods. Some are in shallow graves, others out in the open, covered only by black tarps.
Much better. We had a huge influx of donations.
All have been donated to the University of Tennessee in the name of research, so that forensic scientists can get a better understanding of exactly what happens to a human body after death.
So I want to go ahead and uncover this. This is one that has been out here since the middle of October.
Okay.
And what you're starting to see here is several different colors, and that relates to the breakdown of your blood cells. And you also see insect activity. It's a great place to feed, a great place to live for them, and it's just ideal.
One of the things that I was hoping to do was to...
Bruce McCord is an expert in forensic chemistry who's been working with the team at the Body Farm to study the effects of decomposition on DNA.
I had thought that we could try some different kinds of chemicals. what we have here is a body that's been left out in the elements for a period of time. The body tissue is gone. You're left with these bones. And within the bones, there's still DNA. But what you'd find is that, well, the rain's been coming down, it's exposed to the air, the cells are breaking apart, the bacteria is decomposing the body. Big, long strands of DNA break up into smaller and smaller pieces. And this process occurs over a period of weeks.
After death, DNA quickly degrades into tiny fragments, each 30 million times smaller than when alive. But then the degradation slows down, and it can survive in this fragmented form for thousands of years, as long as the conditions are right.
If you want to recover ancient DNA, hopefully you'll find a site where there's limited ability for oxygen and moisture to get into the bone and further decompose it, and great extremes of temperature won't be occurring.
In 1980, Croatian archaeologists excavated Vinja Cave and found a mass of bones. Among them, an unremarkable fragment known as V80. But for some reason, this bone is packed with DNA. It contains more usable DNA than any other Neanderthal bone that's ever been tested.
The quite extraordinary rich content of DNA in this bone tell us that there was some sort of special condition in this cave what was critical for preservation of DNA in this bone.
Perhaps the temperature was right, the humidity, the soil. But other bones in the Vinja Cave have not yielded as much DNA. There was something special about V80. Its fragmented shape may be a clue. It is widely believed that Neanderthals in this part of Europe practiced cannibalism. Whether for food or for ritual, they were splitting bones and defleshing them. If V80 was cannibalized, it may help explain why its DNA was so well preserved. Stripped of any organic material, the bone would not have attracted the same interest from animals, insects, or microbes. And its DNA would not have deteriorated so quickly.
There are hundreds and hundreds of Neanderthal bones. Many of them have been tested for Neanderthal DNA. Only this bone could unlock the secrets of Neanderthal genome.
But before V80 can be used in the Neanderthal Genome Project, researchers at the Max Planck Institute have to be sure its DNA is really Neanderthal. The biggest obstacle they face is contamination from modern humans. They do everything they can to work in sterile laboratories and keep their DNA out of the equation.
It's almost impossible to distinguish from the DNA sequence if you're looking at the Neanderthal or if you're looking at the modern human. So we have to try to work under very clean conditions, for example, wearing this kind of protection clothes, to in this case not protect us from the samples that we work with, but rather protecting the samples from us, from our own DNA.
Despite the precautions, nearly all Neanderthal samples have already been badly contaminated from years of handling by archaeologists and museum curators. But by sheer good luck, V80 was originally classified as an animal bone. It was locked away and ignored for 20 years. It was barely touched by human hands. When the Neanderthal Genome Project started, researchers hoped they would find other bones that would have as much DNA as V80. But despite searching for 2 years and testing more than 70 bones, they found nothing that's close to matching V80. the conditions in the cave, the circumstances of the death, the inaccurate classification, all combine to make V80 unique. The success of this entire project now depends on this one bone.
3, 2, 1, and liftoff of the Space Shuttle Discovery with the Hubble Space Telescope, our window on the universe.
In 1990, a space shuttle was launched carrying a special payload,
Roll program.
the Hubble telescope.
Roger, roll, Discovery.
Once this remarkable piece of equipment was working properly, it was able to look into the farthest reaches of the universe, picking up the faintest glimmer of light from deeper space. Now scientists are using the same technology on us to look into the farthest reaches of the human cell. Rural Connecticut has been the scene of a recent revolution in genetics. Biotech pioneer Jonathan Rothberg has developed a new system for sequencing DNA. It has sped up the process 100-fold.
DNA is the code of life, and it literally is 3 billion letters from your mom and 3 billion letters from your dad, and these letters are in long strings, just like words or paragraphs or chapters of a book, arranged on your chromosomes. It is your computer program, and this program has evolved and been passed on. I find nothing more fascinating than understanding and working out and decoding the blueprint for humans.
Rothberg's breakthrough in sequencing DNA was to code it with the firefly enzyme luciferase. When loaded into an FLX sequencing machine, the luciferase reacts with a series of 4 different chemicals. Every time there's a reaction, there's a tiny flash of light. Each flash relates to a letter of genetic code, and a camera records them all, gradually building up a composite picture of the entire genome.
We need a camera that has very high resolution, that has many pixels, but also is very fast and is very sensitive because it's very tiny amount of light that we output. But by using an astronomical camera, we can actually capture these many hundreds of thousands faint glimpses of light.
The cameras they're using are the same as the ones developed for the Hubble project, designed to pick up the dimmest light from the most distant galaxy. A new company, 454 Life Sciences, is created to develop the sequencing technology. It announces itself to the world by delivering the first personalized genome.
Jim Watson, the first personal genome.
They choose James Watson for the honor, one of the original discoverers of the structure of DNA. It takes them just 2 months to unravel his entire genetic code. But sequencing the Neanderthal genome promises to be much tougher. Despite the technical advances, the challenge is enormous. Even the star sample, Croatian bone V80, has DNA that's at best only 5% Neanderthal. The rest is DNA from microbes, insects, or even modern humans. To get at the Neanderthal genes, they have to sift through all the other genes as well.
The challenge of deciphering the Neanderthal genome is very akin to taking these shredded novels, which have War and Peace, mixed with 20 other novels. It's further complicated by the fact that I don't know the contents of those other novels, and I don't have a reference to this original Tolstoy. So from scratch, I have to pull out all of these fragments, read all of these fragments and sort out which ones belong to War and Peace and which ones belong to these other novels.
This is precisely what's involved in sequencing the Neanderthal genome. Looking for 3 billion letters within an enormous pile of junk.
We don't have the luxury of reaching in and pulling out just the Neanderthal words, paragraphs, or letters. We have to sort through 60 billion of these letters until we have 3 billion that belong to the Neanderthal. We then have to assemble that into Neanderthal genes, Neanderthal chromosomes, and ultimately the Neanderthal genome.
In October 2007, the Neanderthal Genome Project announces its first significant result. Researchers find evidence of the MC1R gene in Neanderthal DNA.
MC1R is a gene that influences pigmentation. In particular, it can influence your hair color. There's a mutation to MC1R in living Europeans that gives people red hair, for instance.
In modern humans, the MC1R gene sits on chromosome 16. And in 80% of people with red hair, this gene is faulty. Now it seems the same was true of Neanderthals, suggesting that they also may have had red hair.
This gene is the first piece of evidence that we have about a characteristic that's not in the fossils, it's not in the archaeology, it's completely from the gene, but it gives us a very large window of insight into what their adaptation was.
Red hair is thought to be an adaptation to lack of sunlight. Neanderthals lived in Ice Age conditions under leaden skies. It's hardly surprising they may have evolved the same adaptation. But the DNA findings suggest the Neanderthal version of the MC1R gene is subtly different from the modern human version. Because red hair appears to have developed separately in the two species, there's no evidence here of any interbreeding. But another gene's been discovered that's pointing to a different conclusion. A language gene has turned up in Neanderthal DNA, exactly the same version as in modern humans. Scientists are puzzled. It shouldn't be there. It may be the smoking gun they're looking for. Evidence that genes really could and did jump from one human species to another. For centuries, philosophers and scientists have wondered what makes humans special, and invariably they've focused on language. With language, we can make plans, communicate, and socialize like no other animal. Geneticists believe it's an ability hardwired into us. Somewhere in our DNA, there must be some language genes. It's just a matter of finding them. The search led scientists to the Kearney family in London. Half the members of this large family suffer from an unusual speech disorder.
Where do you live, Laura?
May I show it? If best font, may I 6.
Duck.
The Kearneys have a problem articulating words and make simple grammatical mistakes. It is clearly a genetic condition, something that's been passed down from one generation to the next. And in 2001, geneticists found the faulty gene. On chromosome 7 is a big complex gene known as FOXP2. In members of the Kearney family, it's not working properly, affecting their ability to speak. But the rest of us rely on it every time we communicate with others. Scientists believed the human version of FOXP2 emerged about 200,000 years ago, roughly the same time as modern humans, Homo sapiens, emerged in East Africa. Our ancestors would have had an advantage over the Neanderthals, who didn't have the same version of FOXP2 in their DNA. That at least was the theory. But when geneticists started analyzing the Neanderthal genome, they found this language gene. Exactly the same version as in modern humans.
This was quite surprising for us because most people have thought before that this is one of the key genes that differentiates modern humans and Neanderthals. So that actually means that Neanderthals might have had language like we had.
This is quite a turnaround for Neanderthal man. For so long, he was cast in the role of the dumb, grunting brute. Now we discover he shared the language gene FOXP2 with us, and arguably had the same linguistic abilities. But how could the same version of FOXP2 exist in the DNA of Neanderthals and Homo sapiens? The two species had evolved separately for at least 500,000 years.
This gene shouldn't be in both of them. It should be in one or the other. So you have to wonder, did it get there by interbreeding? Was there an interaction between these populations that put that gene there, or that brought it from them into us?
It's an intriguing possibility. A crucial gene for language may have come to us from breeding with Neanderthals. But why would Neanderthals have had anything useful to pass on to modern humans by way of language? For John Hawkes, the clues were to be seen at the rodeo. When tackling any wild beast, whether for fun or food, it makes sense to work as a team, with someone in pole position and others trying to distract the animal and keep it under control.
When you said cowboy,
he believes Neanderthals would have collaborated in exactly the same way when hunting. Their spears were used for impaling animals. They weren't designed to be thrown. So Neanderthals had to get up very close to their prey and run the risk of serious injury. The only way to do this and stay safe was to work as a team, always communicating with each other.
You could imagine that communication is something they were good at. You have to know exactly what everybody's going to do at all times. You have to know how they're going to react when the animal takes this wrong turn. They had to cooperate in a very tightly focused manner. All of those things promote the possibility of adaptations in the brain that would have been valuable in later populations.
By contrast, modern humans came from the African savanna. They had aerodynamic spears that could be thrown with great accuracy. This meant that they could hunt at a distance, reducing their risk of injury. But it also meant they could be more solitary. They could hunt in pairs or on their own. They didn't have the same need to communicate with others.
When we consider the hunting methods of modern humans, they were a little more independent. They could sort of make a living a little bit more for themselves. Whereas Neanderthals were forced to cooperate. They had to work together to get these large animals down with the technology they had available.
According to this way of thinking, language, that most human of abilities, may really be a legacy we inherited from the Neanderthals. And there may be more. Two other genes involved in brain development have recently been discovered in modern DNA. Some scientists think that these genes show signs of having a Neanderthal origin. The modern humans who first arrived in Europe 40,000 years ago were resourceful and intelligent, capable beings. But they may not have had the same range of mental abilities we have today. Only by mixing with ancient humans like the Neanderthals would they have fine-tuned their brains and become truly modern.
When we think of modern humans leaving Africa, I imagine that when this group was expanding, they come into contact with other human populations, they're going to pick up anything that makes you smarter or gives you some cognitive advantage.
Many anthropologists don't accept this argument. They believe the DNA findings are still too new and incomplete to prove the case for interbreeding.
I would certainly not deny that some hanky-panky might well have gone on. What obviously did not happen was any major biologically significant exchange of genes.
There may not be one single answer. So interbreeding may have been more common in some areas of Europe than in others. The fact that we see so little of it in the genetic evidence so far indicates that it was quite rare.
When people talk about interbreeding, they say, well, if they interbred, it wasn't very much. But even a very small amount gives the opportunity for these advantageous things to enter the population. So this tiny amount of interbreeding, if it was small, is enough to have a hugely important effect on the population later in time.
This is one of the great debates of human evolution. Are we a pedigree series with a unique set of genes and characteristics, or really a population of mongrels, a genetic alphabet soup? The only way to know for sure is to keep analyzing the Neanderthal genome, comparing it to ours, looking for overlap. The answers must be there, somewhere in the DNA. "100 years ago, the photographer Edward Curtis began work on a massive project recording the lives of North American Indians. He believed they were a vanishing race, unable to resist the more powerful newcomers who'd moved into their territory. For much of the last 100 years, scientists have thought the same about Neanderthals. Like Native Americans, they were overwhelmed by an outside force.
Neanderthals were doing fine, modern humans show up, Neanderthals disappear. Modern humans are still around.
But now it seems the story may be more complex. Whenever two types of humans come into contact, there's always a possibility that they'll mate. This happened to Native Americans. Whether by choice or not, their genes became mixed up with the genes of new settlers and spread throughout the American population. Today in a city like New York, Native Americans have virtually disappeared. But Native genes survive and continue to be passed down from one generation to the next.
Look at Manhattan. 400 years ago, this island was only a Native American land. Large numbers of immigrants came here from Europe, from Africa, from everywhere. They've built one of the biggest cities in the world so that the traces of the ancient people are hard to find. But those ancient people aren't gone. The Native Americans are still with us. Their genes are still here, interacting with the genes of people from all over the world. When I think of Neanderthals, I think of that kind of interaction, a complex one, across Europe at different times and different places, but one that involved interbreeding. It's a natural human thing. It's what humans do whenever they come into contact.
Sometimes they're mean to each other, sometimes they're nice. Sometimes they trade, sometimes they kill each other. But always they're mating with each other. And I see Neanderthals as being no different.
For 100 years and more, most scientists have regarded Neanderthals as a different species, one that disappeared without leaving any genetic trace among the modern humans that followed.
We obsess about Neanderthals and ourselves and the extinction, but it's nothing extraordinary. Extinction is a normal thing. It's something that's happening all the time. 99% of all species that have existed have become extinct, at least 99%. It's nothing that we really need to dream up special explanations for.
Ever since the first Neanderthal was dug up, it was viewed as an evolutionary dead end, something that was peripheral to human evolution. So to admit that we might have some Neanderthal genes, for some people, that's distasteful.
But in the last decade, the debate has shifted. Today, scientists are more interested in how similar the two species were than how different. It seems that we thought alike, we had the same abilities, we made the same tools. And biologically, there was nothing to stop us from interbreeding. An alternative version of human history is taking root, one in which Neanderthals and modern humans were not so much rivals as potential mates. And thus, the great mystery of Neanderthal extinction is solved. They never went extinct. They were assimilated. Their genes diluted within the modern human gene pool.
The exciting story is the Neanderthal running to hide away from the early modern human who's out to kill him. The exciting story is our ancestors came in and took the continent by force. But really, in a way, the competing story where Neanderthals are slowly absorbed into modern humans is more intriguing, because it's quite possible that there are some genes present in you or me or any number of people that are, in fact, of Neanderthal origin. And that's pretty exciting.
The idea that Neanderthals could pass unnoticed on the New York subway was once a radical idea. Today, many scientists believe that Neanderthals are still here, or rather their genes are, working their way invisibly through the human gene pool, influencing the evolution of our species.
The Neanderthal genes are still with us. There's a little bit of Neanderthal probably in all of us. Those genes helped people. They helped the recipients have more offspring in the long term. So Neanderthal genes contributed to the human story. They're part of what made us human.
In Connecticut, the sequencing machines at 454 Life Sciences keep sifting through billions of particles of DNA. And every day, the scientists get a little closer to cracking the Neanderthal Code. If and when they have a Neanderthal genome, they'll be able to compare it to that of a modern human and work out once and for all whether we exchange genes with them. "38,000 years ago, a man lay dead in a cave in Central Europe. We know almost nothing about him or what killed him. But using his DNA, we may finally know the fate of his species, our cousins, the Neanderthals."